Hello everyone. Tonight, we begin with the story of a people who heal by collapsing, shout to speak to ancestors, and quite literally dance themselves into other realms, from trembling on the sand until your soul leaves your body, to wrestling with invisible illnesses no hospital could diagnose, to boiling a spirit force in your spine that makes your head throb and your teeth hum. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of slightly unhinged anthropology makes your heart beat a little faster. And hey, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Is it midnight where you are? Sunrise? Are you in bed? On a train? In the desert, perhaps? Now settle in, turn off a few lights, let the glow of your screen be the fire. Maybe sip something warm, or listen with one earphone in while the world winds down around you. Let's step barefoot into the dust and meet the rhythm that refuses to die. Let me tell you about the person you could have been, not the you that taps passwords and reads expiration dates. No! I'm talking about the version of you who would have been born under a low sky in a land that forgets to rain, where the wind moves sideways and the sun doesn't care about your comfort. If you'd been born to the Kalahari instead of suburbia, your first lullaby wouldn't be sung. It'd be the distant growl of a lion you're not supposed to fear. Not exactly, just respect. Closely. You would have arrived into a world where nothing belonged to anyone and everything belonged to everyone, except perhaps the fire, and even that had to be earned with patience and friction. Your name wouldn't come from a book, it'd come from how you moved, what bird called when you took your first breath, or whether your father was bitten by a scorpion that week. Names are practical like that. By the time your legs worked, you'd be following tracks most people would mistake for wind. Every mark in the dirt would mean something, a story, a warning dinner. You'd know how to hold your breath when the wind changed. You'd understand what a nervous springbok smells like. You'd sit still enough to hear roots drinking. No, really. You wouldn't have furniture. You'd have fire circles and sleeping hides. You'd travel light, not out of poverty, but because when the earth feeds you, you don't weigh her down. And the stars above you? They'd be so many and so bright, you wouldn't dare name them all. That would be arrogant. You'd just thank them quietly for watching. And there'd be laughter. Constant, strange, irreverent laughter. The kind that only comes from people who know each other too well and still choose to stay. There are no chiefs here, no thrones. If you ever tried to act important, they'd laugh you back into place before you finished your sentence. Status dissolves quickly in the heat, and no one trusts a man who builds a pedestal in the sand. Here, you wouldn't measure time in hours, you'd measure it in meat drying, in children's footprints disappearing with the wind, in how long it takes for a story to make everyone cry, then laugh, then cry again. Your economy, built on jokes, gifts, and the deep old knowledge of how to find water under rock. And you wouldn't be alone. Never alone. Not really. There's no such thing as privacy in a circle. Everyone sees, everyone hears, everyone carries your story with them. You'd get tired of it sometimes, of being known that deeply. But you'd also miss it the moment you stepped away. And there behind all that, behind the laughter, the arrows, the firelight, something else waits. Quiet. Patient. Always watching. A force that has no word in English and no place in PowerPoint presentations. It stirs in the dust, in the spine, in the eyes of the elders who've seen it dance before. You'll meet it soon, but first, you need to learn how to listen. Let me tell you what your nights might have looked like. No screens, no headlights, just fire, alive and cracking, surrounded by the slow rustle of bodies finding their place. You're older now. Old enough to stay up past the jackal's laughter. Old enough that someone's handed you a rattle, not a toy, an invitation. You're not at a party. This isn't celebration. Holy, this is work. Painful, necessary work. And the whole community's here, not because it's optional, but because it's survival. The women sit first. Always the women. They form the circle. Not just socially, but cosmically. They're the core, the pulse. They clap, and when they clap, it's not random. Each rhythm means something. There's no conductor, no rehearsal. They just know. Their songs come from places older than any cathedral, passed from lung to lung like sacred smoke. You'll hear melodies with no words and others that repeat one word so many times it stops sounding like language and becomes something else, a key maybe, or a lever. And you're dancing, or rather, your feet are. Your mind checked out a few minutes ago. At first, it's awkward, always is. You try to move right, but there is no right, only deep. You try to focus, and that's your first mistake. Thinking breaks it. You have to give in. The sand's under your feet, but it might as well be air. Your breath is shallow, fast, too fast. Good. That's when it starts working. That's when the heat rises. You feel it in your spine. Your skin prickles. The hair on your arms doesn't just stand up. It salutes. And somewhere inside you, something tight and ancient starts to boil. Yes, boil. There's really no better word for it. That's the thing about the trance dance. It's not a show. It's not entertainment. It's a weapon.
A ritual of resistance against sickness, against death, against that creeping sense that something has gone wrong. And no one knows how to name it. The dance names it. The dance fights it. And the ones who collapse, yes, collapse. Those are the ones you thank. They're the ones who went the farthest, saw the most. They're the ones who danced until the fire inside, until they fell with their eyes rolled back and their bodies shaking like trees struck by lightning.
You've seen it. Maybe you were it. There's no curtain call, no applause, just breath and dust and that eerie stillness afterward when everyone stares at the ground like it might speak. But it's not over, because now the has started to stir. And you, friend, you're about to find out what it does to a person. It starts as a tingling, low, deep, right at the base of your spine. They call it though no word will ever really do. It's not a feeling, it's not a spirit. It's more like a temperature shift inside your soul, like someone lit a fuse in your kidneys and walked away without telling you what it's connected to. And it rises, slowly at first, until your body begins to twitch, not in fear, in recognition, because this is what you came for, this is the reason you dance. The old healers, the ones with the clouded eyes and the cracked heels, they told you it would feel like heat, like boiling sap moving up your spine, pushing through your ribs, your neck, until finally it reaches the crown of your head. And when it does, it opens something. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Something opens, your chest starts to shake. Not just with breath, but with force, as if the air itself is dragging something out of you, or into you. And right about now, you're sweating like you swallowed the sun. Your hands tremble. You fall. You don't remember the moment your knees hit the ground. That part's not yours anymore. And then, you see, not with your eyes, but with something behind them, behind even thought, shapes, light, fire without flame, animals moving in ways no animal ever should. There's a river, but it flows upward. There's a voice, but it's yours and not yours. You're not in the circle anymore. You're flying. Or being dragged, or both. This is not ecstasy. It's not bliss. It's pain. It burns. It shakes you apart. And yet, you go with it. Because this burning is what makes healing possible. You're not just fixing someone's illness. You're dragging it out of the world. wrestling with it, talking it down like a drunk god. The healers say that when the en rises fully, it becomes something else. It becomes Kia, the state beyond trance, the place where your spirit leaves your body, and your body becomes just a trembling shell left to handle the paperwork. And while you're gone, flying, sinking, convulsing, those around you begin to watch. Carefully, silently. Because now you're not just a dancer. You're a healer, a conduit. And whatever sickness or sorrow was hanging in the air, you've pulled it in. It's moving through you now like smoke through a pipe. And it's gonna hurt. Sometimes you scream. Sometimes you bark like a jackal. Sometimes you whisper things you don't remember later. And that's good. That means it's working. The fire crackles, the women's clapping never stops, they don't dare. It holds the space, keeps the spirits from getting ideas, and when you come back, if you come back, you'll be soaked, empty, lighter, but not safe, not yet. Because this fire, this heat, this boiling gift inside you, it doesn't leave you alone after the dance. It stays. And it wants to dance again. But here's the strange part. You're not special. Not really. Because in this circle, anyone can learn to carry the fire. You don't need a title. You don't get a certificate. No one's building you a shrine. If you want to be a healer, you earn it by dancing until your ribs ache and your teeth hum. You do it by collapsing enough times that the elders nod at you like you finally stopped being a tourist. That's how you join the line. Not of leaders, but of those willing to fall for others. And no one does it alone. The trance isn't yours. It belongs to the group. You may be the one thrashing in the sand, but behind you, the whole community is holding the rhythm. The women clapping don't stop, even if their palms go raw. Their singing, ancient and haunting, keeps your spirit from floating off too far. And if it does go too far, they'll pull you back, with water, with whispers, with smoke and touch and sheer will. You see, this dance isn't just about healing fevers or stiff joints. It's for grief, for anger, for jealousy, simmering just under someone's polite smile. It's how they keep the village from cracking apart under the pressure of being human in a place where survival leaves no room for drama. Someone offended you? Dance. Your child's been sick for days? Dance. Someone's been having those dreams again? Dance. The only law here is that whatever darkness has crept in, it must leave through sweat. And so they gather. Not on a schedule. Not on command. When it's needed. When someone wakes up with that certain heaviness in their bones, or when a zebra walks the wrong direction, or when the air just feels off. That's how the community knows. It's time. The fire's lit. The circle forms. And the women sing their ribs open once more. No one watches from the sidelines. That's not how it works. Even the babies are there, strapped to backs, bouncing gently to the beat of 1,000 years. Even the grumpy uncle who always complains, he's clapping. He remembers, he's danced before, he'll dance again. And it's not glamorous. You won't find anyone documenting it for their personal brand. There's no merchandise, no backstage pass. Just dust, firelight, and the occasional old man groaning through tears while a young woman channels something she doesn't fully understand. Yet. You don't get to pick your role. You might sing for 20 years before the enum even flickers. You might fall into trance the first time and wake up afraid. That's fine. No one rushes you, but no one spares you either. Healing is everyone's job. You do your part, or someone else carries more than their share. And in this place, the Kalahari, where the stars don't blink and the land doesn't forgive, imbalance is not taken lightly. So you keep showing up. You keep clapping. You keep listening. And maybe one night, the fire will reach for you. And you'll be ready, or you won't, but it won't matter, because the rhythm keeps going, whether or not you understand it. And when that rhythm does reach for you, when it slips through your ribs and shakes something loose, well, that's when you start seeing things. Not hallucinations, not dreams, encounters. Because in the San world, sickness doesn't come from nowhere. It's not a germ or a glitch in the system, it's a disturbance, a ripple in the unseen. Maybe an ancestor is restless. Maybe someone cursed your name with a whisper. Maybe you just stepped wrong near a termite mound with too much history in it.
Either way, things get off and someone's got to make them right. That someone is often the dancer lying on the ground with sand in their mouth and a nosebleed that no one seems particularly alarmed about. You see, when the trance really hits, when the boils over and becomes Kia, the spirit leaves the body. That's the whole point. You're not here anymore. Your body is here, sure, twitching on the edge of collapse, while a child nearby looks slightly concerned, but also slightly...
But you've gone walking. Where? Hard to say. The San call it the spirit world, but don't bother picturing clouds and harps. It's more like walking through memory, through metaphor, through everything that's ever gone wrong and might go wrong again. Healers describe flying, or turning into animals, sometimes both. One minute you're floating above the village, the next you're arguing with a hyena about your cousin's fever. The lines blur, and in this space things become obvious. That cough wasn't just a cough. That man's bad luck. Not random. There's something clinging to him, something cold, something hungry. And so you do what healers do. You wrestle it with your words, your body, your trembling breath. You demand it leave. Back in the waking world, your body twitches harder. Your jaw tightens. Your hands reach. Someone murmurs encouragement. Another pours water on your feet. The women keep singing. The rhythm keeps you tethered, a line between worlds. Without that rhythm, you might not come back. Some don't. And when it works, when the spirit is driven off, when the pain lifts, when the air shifts, no one cheers. They just know the sick person wakes up hungry. The angry man stops shouting. The children sleep better. The dogs stop pacing. Something invisible has been moved, and everyone can feel it. But you don't feel victorious. You feel wrecked. Your back aches. Your head rings. You might not remember much, just fragments. Smoke.
Animals, someone crying in a voice that didn't sound human. And, in your bones, it's not over. It never is. The spirits are pain. So is sickness. And sooner or later, someone will need help again, and you'll go back into the fire. Into the circle, into the place where the dead lean too close and the world turns in, because this is what healing looks like. Not white robes but trembling legs, cracked lips and a scream swallowed by
And
dust.
in a world like this, where spirits hover just beyond the firelight and the living walk side by side with the dead, you might expect hierarchy, power, someone in charge to keep the cosmic plumbing from bursting. But no, here, no one's above the rest, not even the ones who leave their bodies twice a week and come back with sand in their hair and cryptic messages from a lizard. No priests, no gurus, no shaman-branded merchandise, just people, sitting, clapping, dancing. And that's the strange beauty of it. Power doesn't accumulate, it circulates. You don't rise by dominating, you rise by giving more, by enduring longer, by dancing until your knees betray you and the fire answers back. And when it's over, you go back to your place in the circle like nothing happened. Because that's what the dance teaches. Quietly, underneath all the noise. No one gets to stay important. Not for long. Everyone's needed. No one's indispensable. Even the most seasoned healer, the one whose hands have pulled fever out of babies and calmed fights before they exploded, she still has to show up, still has to clap, still has to sit beside the one who just collapsed for the first time and treat them like the fire chose well. The women, the women. They're not background singers in this ritual, they're the engine. Their clapping isn't just support, it's control. They hold the rhythm. They set the tempo. Their voices rise and fall like waves, and the whole dance rides on their breath. They don't enter trance usually, but they make trance possible. You, sitting in that circle, might never collapse, might never feel the enum boil up and crack you open like a seed pod. And that's fine. No one measures your value by how dramatic your trance is. They watch how you show up, how you support, how you carry the quiet weight of someone else's pain without making it yours. And when someone falls, the group doesn't flinch. They lean in, they protect, they cool your forehead with hands that know too much. Because the moment trance begins, you stop being just a person and start being the vessel through which the whole community gets lighter. There's no audience, no them and us. It's not a performance. It's not even sacred in the way we use that word. All stained glass and hushed tones. It's sacred like breathing, sacred like bleeding. Something done because not doing it would tear everything loose, and so they gather. Night after night, year after year, generation after generation. They gather not because they want to be healed, but because they know they will need to be, eventually. So they keep the fire ready, the songs sharp, the rhythm steady, and when the world tips, as it always does, they're ready to catch each other. Even if it means falling, but not all falling is visible. Some kinds happen slowly, under the surface, without ceremony or song, because the world these people dance in, and the world you've come to know through ash and breath and knees in the sand, it's not immune to outside weather. And by weather, I mean borders, governments, missions, clipboards. The slow, bureaucratic collapse of ways of living that don't fit into boxes labeled economically viable. You wouldn't have seen it coming at first. A well, a road, a school. Development, they called it. Progress with a smile and a truck full of vitamins. But soon, the hunting grounds were gone. So were the tracks. The dances still happened, yes, but quieter, less often. Watched, because eventually someone told them they were wrong. That the spirits weren't real, that trance was dangerous, that Jesus didn't like screaming. And the songs that had held the people together for millennia were suddenly labeled superstition. Noise, tribal nonsense. There were meetings, papers, permission slips, and always, always that look. The one that says we know better. The irony, of course, is that the people who knew how to live in a desert without killing it were now being told how to be civilized by people who couldn't find water if it screamed its location through a megaphone. In some places, the trance dance was outright banned. In others, it just faded. Because how do you dance if your fire has been moved? If your children are at school learning to forget? If the spirits you used to call have been replaced by schedules and fences, and yet, they kept dancing, even in secret, even in fragments, even when their land was stripped and their names were rewritten on someone else's map. Because you can remove a person from the land, but good luck removing the land from the person. And the San, they are the Kalahari. They carry it in their breath, in the way they sit, in the songs that still rise from their chests like something defiant and older than logic. Now the dances may be fewer, the fire circles smaller, but the rhythm, that rhythm, still moves under their skin, because they've learned how to hide it when needed, how to whisper instead of shout, how to wait. The spirits haven't left. they've just become more patient. And you, if you had been born into this world, you would have felt the difference. You would have known when a ritual was missing. You would have noticed the nights growing heavier, the dreams getting stranger. You would have seen what it costs to let silence fall where a song used to live. But the story doesn't end in silence, because there are still those who remember. And the fire, it turns out, only needs a spark. And here's the thing about fire. It doesn't need permission. It just needs oxygen. And when the San gather around their circle, whether on ancestral land or in a fenced-off plot next to a mission building with peeling paint, something ancient still sparks, because even stripped of half their world, they never gave up the rhythm. And in the San cosmos, rhythm is law. You might not notice it at first. The way voices fall into sync without command. The way everyone sits facing inward, not out. No platform, no front row, just a ring. And in that ring, balance. Not theoretical, not philosophical, real, breathing social balance, held in place by story, by laughter, and, when needed, by the trance dance. You'd notice there are no thrones. No one wears feathers to feel tall. If someone starts acting too important, the group gently cuts them back down to size with ridicule. A polite, public roasting. It's not petty, it's maintenance, like sharpening a tool. In this place, arrogance is a liability. It makes people sick. It makes the spirits restless. So they keep it trimmed with jokes. You wouldn't find a chief here, you'd find consensus, which sounds romantic, until you've sat through a 3-day argument about who gets to move the fire pit. But even the arguing has rhythm. Everyone talks, everyone listens, eventually. Decisions are slow, because fast decisions break things. Slow ones heal. And when conflict simmers, as it always does, when humans share too much dust and too little meat, it doesn't get hidden under rugs or behind walls. It gets danced out, literally. If you're angry, you show up to the trance dance. If someone hurt you, you sit across from them in the circle and watch them sweat through penance. The fire doesn't take sides, it takes everything, churns it in the sand, and spits out something clean. This is not justice in the way you might know it. There's no punishment, no court, just heat and dust, and the understanding that healing isn't just for the sick, it's for the connected, which is everyone, always.
And maybe you get frustrated. You, with your neat definitions of right and wrong. You might want answers, consequences, but they just raise an eyebrow and ask you what good a grudge does in a world where you have to rely on the man who wronged you to find tomorrow's waterhole. You don't get to disappear into individualism here. You belong, whether you like it or not. And sometimes that belonging feels suffocating, but more often,
The kind of safety that comes not from walls, but from being seen, fully, annoyingly, lovingly. And when you collapse into trance, and the old woman steadies your shaking shoulders, she's not doing it because she pities you. She's doing it because next time it might be her. That's how circles work. They come back around, because the only real crime here is forgetting you're part of one. So now you're part of the circle. Maybe not a healer yet, not fully, but you've danced, you've fallen, you've come back with your skin buzzing and your mouth full of ash. You've seen the way people look at you afterward, not like you're holy, like you're useful. And that's when the real cost starts to sink in, because you don't get to switch it off. That or the boiling spirit fire you once begged to feel, doesn't politely exit your spine after the dance. It lingers, it hums through your nerves at odd times. When you're hunting, when you're sitting quietly, when someone laughs and it sounds wrong. It's like your insides have learned to listen in a different key. The key of imbalance, the key of sickness. And when something in the community is off, it taps you on the ribs and says, do something. So you do. You dance again. You fall again. You burn again. And each time it gets a little heavier, not in a way that breaks you, in a way that remakes you. You start to notice the tremors behind people's words, the tightness in shoulders, the way someone laughs too loud and doesn't meet your eyes. And when you see it, you don't say much. You just show up early next time the fire's lit. You stand a little closer. You let the rhythm pull you under before the sick one even arrives. Because this is what being a healer means. It means carrying things no one sees. It means getting up after a collapse that left your muscles screaming and your teeth chattering and saying, yeah, I'm fine. It means sweating in the dark while your spirit stretches into places your language hasn't caught up to. And it's not glamorous. Your knees ache. Your back's a mess. You look like someone who's fought a dust storm with their face and lost. People give you strange glances in the daylight, especially when your gaze lingers a bit too long on their left shoulder because you thought you saw something there. But the worst part? You start to want it. The dance. The fire. The raw, electric moment where your body disappears and you become the trembling bridge between pain and peace. You start craving it. Not because it's fun, because it's right. Because without it, the world starts to feel wrong, heavy, out of step. You feel
And yet,
called. No one praises you. No one builds you a house or gives you a title. You're not paid. You're not protected. You're just expected. Like the fire, like the sand, like the stars that don't blink. Because here's the truth. Healers burn themselves to keep the circle balanced. And balance, as it turns out, is never free. And balance, it doesn't survive by accident. It's taught. Slowly, repeatedly, and almost always when you're not in the mood to learn. You don't wake up one day a healer, ready to roll your eyes back and chase off bad spirits like a spiritual exterminator. No, you start much earlier. Sitting at the edge of the fire, legs crossed, half asleep, trying to mimic the claps of the older women while your voice cracks like dry bark. And you watch. That's the first thing. Before you fall, before the wakes in you, before you understand a single thing, you just watch. The dance, the collapses, the return. You watch people you've known your whole life become something else, and then return quietly to normal, as if they hadn't just screamed into the dirt while negotiating with the dead. And when the time comes, when someone finally hands you a rattle or tells you to stand closer to the fire, it's not some grand initiation. It's practical, like being handed a broom. Here, we think you're ready. Don't mess it up. But even then, especially then, you're not taught in straight lines. There are no lectures, no guidebooks. You learn through repetition, through pain, through the careful, brutal, sacred business of trial and error. One night you might enter trance too fast and come out shaking for hours, unable to form a sentence. Another night you might dance for hours and feel nothing, and wonder if the fire's ignoring you on purpose. You'll ask questions and get answers in metaphor, or worse, in riddles. What does it mean when I see smoke but smell rain? Ask the jackal. Thanks. Very helpful. And still you show up. Because something inside you has been rewired, permanently. Children grow up watching this. They grow up clapping the rhythms before they understand the meaning. They play trance dance the way others play house. But behind the game, something is seeping in, the patterns, the stories, the heat. They'll remember which song made their mother cry. They'll remember who fell hardest and who got up slowest. They'll remember that healing isn't magic. It's work. Eventually, one of them will step forward, probably scared, probably too young. But the fire will pull them anyway, and they'll join the long, unbroken thread of knowledge that doesn't come in books, only in breath. Because nothing about this is casual. It's an apprenticeship to the invisible. And the test isn't a ceremony. It's what happens the moment someone says, "We need help," and the circle looks at you, and you won't be ready. Not really, no one ever is. But you'll stand anyway, because the rhythm's already inside you. And it's not interested in waiting. And just when you found your rhythm, just when the enum fits in your bones like it was always there, the world changes again. Not the spirit world. Not the one with jackals and dead ancestors who tug at your dreams. No, the other one. The loud one. With boots, with flags, with officials who don't understand the first thing about balance, but still insist on weighing everything. You don't remember exactly when it started. Maybe it was when the missionaries arrived, preaching that the only acceptable trance is the kind you can sit still for. Or maybe it was when the men with maps arrived, drawing lines across land no one ever asked to be divided. Either way, things begin to tilt. The hunts grow fewer. The land shrinks. The places where the dance once echoed freely are suddenly fenced off, paved over, or labeled protected by people who've never needed to find water with a stick and a prayer. Now there are permits, time slots, curious visitors with cameras who want to see the authentic stuff, but get uncomfortable when the collapse gets too real. And the spirits? They don't care for paperwork. So the trance dance goes underground, not literally. The sand's still the same, but spiritually. The fires are lit in whispers now. The singing is softer. The elders glance around before starting the rhythm like they're committing a small, holy crime. In some places, the dance fades, not because it stopped working, but because the people were told it shouldn't. Told it was backward, primitive, dangerous, too much shouting, too much touching, too much that couldn't be explained by men in ties with funding to protect cultures they don't actually want to understand. But in other places, it survives. Sometimes it even adapts. There are dances where old songs blend with new ones, where trance is followed by Christian prayers, where the fire circle is lit, not in defiance, but in quiet insistence. We are still here. And those who remember, the old ones, the tired ones, the ones whose knees remember every collapse, they teach, carefully, selectively. Not everyone is ready. And not everyone who wants to learn can be trusted to keep the fire sacred.
You, if you'd grown up in this time, would have had to ask different questions. You wouldn't just learn how to fall, you'd have to learn where it's safe to fall, who to trust with your shaking, who to let see the moment when the spirit inside you breaks through your skin. Because when the dance is watched, it changes. And when it's misunderstood, it becomes a performance. But when it's remembered deeply, fully, it becomes something else, a slow rebellion.
A memory too loud to erase, a heartbeat still thudding in the dust. And even if it's quieter now, even if it's rare, even if the fire is lit behind closed doors, the rhythm hasn't stopped, not yet. And now that you've danced through it, or at least stood at the edge long enough to feel its heat, you might wonder what this all means. What is this trance dance really? Is it religion? Ceremony? Choreographed? Group therapy? Held together by dust and ancestral guilt? And not really, because here's where things get messy. Not spiritually, academically. You see, for decades, anthropologists have been tiptoeing around the fire, scribbling furiously in their notebooks while trying not to look startled when someone collapses mid-song. They came with questions, with theories, with degrees, and often with the kind of facial expressions reserved for people trying to understand a culture by squinting at it. But to be fair, some of them tried, really tried. Richard Katz, Megan Beasler, Lawrence van der Post, names you probably skipped in the library, but people who sat, listened, and got dust in places they didn't expect. They tried to explain that this dance isn't just ritual, it's a living, breathing archive. That when a sand healer trembles in the sand, you're not watching superstition, you're watching a memory system, a healing system, a cosmos written in sweat instead of stone. Katz called it healing through community. Van der Post couldn't help but romanticize it. Others got tangled in terms like shamanism and altered states of consciousness, which is academic speak for we don't know exactly what's happening, but it's intense and probably meaningful. They filmed, they took notes, they published papers that sat on shelves gathering the same dust the dancers were breathing. And slowly, reluctantly, the trance dance became a case study, a chapter. A PowerPoint slide labeled early religious behavior in hunter-gatherer societies. But what they couldn't quite capture, what slipped through the footnotes, was that this wasn't a frozen relic from humanity's childhood. It's still happening. It's happening when a woman's hands go numb from clapping for hours straight because she knows her sister needs healing. It's happening when a teenager falls into trance for the first time and comes back weeping because the world behind the world just showed him his grandfather's face. It's happening when the circle forms, unremarked, unfilmed, unmeasured, simply because something in the air has changed. Anthropologists tried to pin it down, they tried to understand it. Some even came close, but you, had you been born into this rhythm, wouldn't need to study it. You'd already know. Because here, the ritual doesn't begin with research, it begins with breath. And if you lose the rhythm, if the fire flickers, you don't write a paper. You relight it, but relighting it, that takes more than dry twigs and memory. Because when outsiders came, with their white collars and heavy boots, they didn't just misunderstand the dance, they tried to unmake it. With good intentions, of course. Always good intentions. That's the most dangerous kind. They came bearing salvation. Not water, not meat, but Bibles, clinics, schools with rigid timetables, and an urgent need for children to sit still. They frowned at trance, that strange shouting, that dangerous sweating. They called it demonic, or childish, or something people should have grown out of by now. And so under the same skies where your ancestors once collapsed in spiritual fire, you would have been taught to stand still, to be quiet, to recite, to stop twitching, to stop seeing. It was done politely most of the time. No fires were stamped out. Not directly. Just smothered. Rituals were discouraged. Drums discouraged. Clapping frowned upon. Teachers told children gently to stop singing those songs, to stop asking about ancestors, to stop mimicking the fall. Some listened, some didn't. Some danced anyway, behind the trees, under silence, inside themselves. And those who danced didn't always come back the same, because dancing in secret changes the rhythm, makes it thinner, tighter, like trying to shout underwater. The missionaries didn't just erase beliefs, they rewrote them, repackaged spirits into sins, told mothers their trances were symptoms, told fathers their visions were delusions, told entire communities that their oldest medicine was incompatible with salvation. And it worked little. Long enough for a generation to doubt, long enough for some children to stop asking questions, to learn how to clap along to someone else's rhythm, to think of their ancestors with embarrassment instead of awe. But culture is stubborn. The kind that's danced barefoot into the earth doesn't vanish. It waits. And slowly, a quiet resistance formed. Some dances returned, tentatively, woven between hymns. Some healers learned to nod politely in church and then light the fire after dark. Some elders refused to go silent, even when silence was safer. Had you lived through that shift, might have felt torn. Caught between two worlds, one that promised progress and paved roads, one that pulled your spirit through your spine and made the stars feel close again. You'd smile at the missionaries, you'd thank the teachers, and then, when the time was right, you'd dance. Not because you were rebellious, but because the spirits never stopped whispering, and you were finally ready to answer. And when you danced again, after all that, it wasn't just for healing anymore. It was for remembering. Because in a world that's tried so hard to rebrand your ancestors as footnotes, every step in that circle is an act of defiance, a soft, rhythmic refusal to forget. You're not just clapping for balance, you're clapping for survival, for continuity, for proof that your people are still here, that this land still knows your footsteps, that the fire still knows your name, and the dance, it's still doing what it always did. Not just fixing bones and banishing fevers, but stitching the invisible fabric of the group back together. You'd see it. The way things settle afterward, the way the air feels different. Someone laughs more easily. Someone else finally makes eye contact. The baby who's been sick for 3 days sleeps through the night. That's not a miracle. That's a system working exactly as intended, because this is what the trance dance truly is, resilience disguised as ritual. It's a community reaching inside itself to clean the wounds no one talks about. It's a people who've had their land cut, their language sliced, their gods renamed, and who still choose to circle up and clap like it all still matters. Because it does. Maybe now more than ever. You, in this version of your life, would have grown up understanding that the dance is not optional. That even if you never collapse, even if the never boils in your gut, your presence is part of the healing. Your body, your voice, your rhythm, they are the medicine. No participation is passive. No hand is wasted. You'd see the old women who can no longer stand still, singing with a volume that could bend iron. You'd see children clapping offbeat and being gently nudged back in. You'd see teenage boys too cool for spirits who still show up because their uncle fell into trance last week and came back crying like a cracked drum. And you'd know, truly know, that what holds this together isn't belief, it's rhythm, it's memory, it's need. A deep, communal need to not fall apart, even when everything outside the fire is designed to pull you in pieces. So yes, the dance still happens, not always in the open, not always with full strength, but it happens because when everything else is taken, land, language, dignity, there's still the body, there's still breath, there's still dust, there's still rhythm. And as long as those remain, the Sand people will remember who they are, not with words, but with movement. And now you know what it means. To fall, to burn, to return. But you still don't know what it means to collapse. Not just spiritually. Not just in the poetic sense, I mean collapse. As in, your body giving out in front of everyone, your muscles seizing like they're being played by an invisible puppeteer who's forgotten the ending, your skin slick, your heartbeat a hammer, your jaw locked so tight you can taste your ancestors in your molars, because this is the moment everyone waits for. Quietly, respectfully, terrified. When a healer falls, it's not failure, it's the arrival, the sign that the has gone critical, that it's no longer moving through the body, but taking it over. And from here, anything can happen. You might groan. You might speak in tongues. You might scream the name of a dead relative who never liked you in life and still has questions. You might lie still for an hour, breath shallow, eyes blank, while the others circle you with chants and water and a strange mix of awe and practical concern. Because yes, you've entered the sacred realm. but also you might be overheating. And when you come back, when the twitching subsides, when your limbs are yours again, you're not the same. No one is. The collapse doesn't just take energy. It takes something else, something unnamed. And it leaves something behind too. You're lighter, also shakier, also starving, but more than anything, you're seen. The group saw you go there, they saw the collapse. And now they look at you like someone who's visited the back room of the universe and brought back a receipt. And the spirits? They saw it too. Sometimes they whisper after, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you find yourself weeping into your knees, not because you're sad, but because your body doesn't know what else to do with the weight it just carried. But here's the strange thing, you'll do it again, even knowing how it feels, even knowing what it takes, because the collapse isn't punishment, it's passage. You fall so someone else doesn't have to. You burn so the circle stays whole. And in the sand world, there is no greater gift, no higher act. So when you rise, knees dusted, lips cracked, they say some people fear death, others run from it. And then there were those peculiar few who sat quietly, day after day, in the hush of cedar forests, training not to escape death, but to master it. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, no, they meant it quite literally. In the chill shadows of northern Japan, amid ancient stone temples that smell like moss and incense, a group of monks once did something so extreme, so patient, so appallingly serene that even the dead might raise an eyebrow. These men chose to mummify themselves alive, voluntarily, cheerfully even. And no, it wasn't a punishment, or a misunderstanding of medical science, or a performance art piece for future documentaries. It was devotion. Silent, grueling, absolute. They weren't trying to die, exactly. Dying was just a byproduct. What they really wanted was to transcend, to become, quite inconveniently for modern sensibilities, living Buddhas. That is, corpses so pure, so incorruptible, that decay politely passed them by. And they weren't buried. Oh no, they buried themselves. This practice has a name, of course, they always do. It's called Sokushin Butsu, and it didn't belong to some forgotten fringe cult out in the rice paddies. It was part of Shingon Buddhism, one of Japan's most esoteric and, let's say, spiritually athletic traditions. It required decades of preparation, endless endurance, and a stomach for things like bark soup, isolation, and being sealed in a box underground. Alive. Now, if this is your first encounter with monks turning themselves into mummies without waiting for death to arrive naturally, well, buckle up, because the process is far worse and far more poetic than you might think. See, Sokushin Butsu wasn't about defying death. It was about working with it, courting it even, like a long, awkward date that ends with enlightenment and total bodily preservation. A monk didn't simply starve. No, that would be barbaric. He purified, slowly, meticulously. Every meal, every chant, every breath was another step toward the grave and beyond. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand why a perfectly sane monk in 18th century Japan would spend a decade preparing to entomb himself in a pine box with an air pipe and a tiny bell, you have to understand where he came from, what he believed, what the world looked like when immortality wasn't a fantasy. It was a choice. And so to really begin this tale, we have to walk back in time into a mist-soaked Japan where mountains weren't just rock and root. They were portals. The body wasn't a prison, but it was a vessel for awakening. And death? Death was just a particularly strict teacher. Shall we go? Now, before these monks sealed themselves up like human letters to eternity, they had to be convinced the post office would actually deliver. Which brings us, rather elegantly, to Shingon Buddhism, a spiritual tradition so intricate it makes quantum physics look like origami instructions. Founded in the 9th century by a charismatic overachiever named Kukai, or Kobo Daishi if you're feeling reverent, Shingon was esoteric, elite, and incredibly fond of rituals that the general public didn't understand and weren't invited to. Kukai, by the way, was no mild-mannered monk. He was a scholar, artist, calligrapher, mystic, and somehow had time to allegedly invent the Japanese syllabary in his spare hours. But more importantly, he imported a dazzling array of tantric Buddhist practices from China, mixed them with Japanese mountain worship, and stirred until visions of enlightenment took on terrifyingly literal form. He taught that enlightenment wasn't something that happened after death. No, it was available right now, if you were willing to dismantle your ego, your appetites, and eventually your circulatory system. The mountain hermits loved this, particularly those from Shugendo, a syncretic tradition that combined Buddhism, Shinto, Taoism, and a deep love of climbing dangerous cliffs barefoot. These were ascetics who believed that physical suffering unlocked spiritual power. Hunger wasn't a hardship, it was a sacrament. Exposure wasn't punishment, it was purification. And the mountain was alive, watching, judging, waiting. By the time Sokushinbutsu emerged in the 11th or 12th century, Japan had already woven together a tapestry of spiritual severity that made mortification of the flesh look almost fashionable. But the practice really bloomed during the Edo period, when the country was sealed off from the rest of the world, and isolation, spiritual, political, and geographical, became the norm. Entire regions operated like microcosmic kingdoms, and up north in Dewa province, now Yamagata prefecture, temples like Mount Udono's Dainichibo became strange little laboratories of immortality. This wasn't Egypt. There were no oils or linens, no pyramids, just cold stone, misty forests, and men in faded robes eating pine needles. And here's a thought. In the West, the dead rot and the soul is saved, but in Sokushinbutsu the body becomes the salvation. The flesh doesn't betray, it endures.
It transcends. If preserved correctly, it proves some, not just faith, but mastery, a refusal to vanish. It's all very poetic, in a bleak, bone-rattling way. But let's be honest, it's also deeply unsettling, because while other religions might promise eternity with a wink and a hymn, these monks were busy making visible, undeniable proof.
Mummies that didn't just suggest sanctity. They were sanctity, sitting there in glass cases, staring back at you with hollowed eyes that once chanted sutras in the dark. And the public? They came, they knelt, they whispered, some cried, some brought offerings, because what do you do in the presence of a man who willed his body not to rot? You listen, and if you're like me, you ask how. The path to self-mummification wasn't something you stumbled into after a bad week at the monastery. No. This was a spiritual marathon run at a glacial pace, where each step was a tiny death, and each choice shaved off another layer of the self. Sokushinbutsu wasn't a ritual. It was a lifestyle. One that began with food, of course, as all terribly human things do. Enter the first phase, Makuji Kigyo, literally tree-eating training, and it's exactly what it sounds like. For 1,000 days, yes 1,000, the aspiring mummy would adopt a diet consisting almost entirely of roots, nuts, bark, and berries foraged from the surrounding forest. Think of it as the original raw vegan cleanse, except there were no cheat days, no spirulina, and no one clapping for you on Instagram. Just the occasional pine cone and the knowledge that this wasn't about health. It was about desiccation, because the goal wasn't wellness. It was the slow, deliberate removal of moisture and fat from the body. Fat, you see, goes rancid. Water invites decay. The monk was becoming a sculpture when the only acceptable material was dry, clean bone wrapped in uncorrupted skin. After a few years of bark and silence, if the monk hadn't died of exposure, parasites, or the sheer despair of eating lichen for breakfast, he moved on to stage 2, New Jogyo. This is where it gets truly monastic, and quite frankly, a little grotesque. Now the monk begins to cut fluids, and not just in the trendy intermittent fasting sense. This is a complete withdrawal from normal hydration, combined with even more intense meditation and immobility. The body begins to shrink inward, organs protesting quietly, breath growing thinner. It's not starvation technically. Starvation implies resistance. This was participation. And then the final act, the burial. They would dig a pit just wide enough for one seated body. Inside went a small pine box, lacquered to resist insects. The monk would climb in cross-legged, clutching a string of prayer beads. A tiny bamboo air pipe was inserted through the lid, a bell placed in his hands. Each day he would ring it once to signal he was still alive. The others listened from above, in silence. One day, usually within a week, the bell stopped. They waited a few more days, then removed the air pipe, sealed the box, and left it buried for about 1,000 more. If the body had decayed when they finally unearthed it, the attempt was considered admirable but unsuccessful. He was reburied with honors. But if the skin remained tight over the bones, if the flesh was intact, if no smell emerged, then he had done it. He had become a Sokushin Butsu, a living Buddha, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but physically, spiritually, permanently. His body was then cleaned, robed, and placed in a temple, often in a seated pose, hands still clutched around those same prayer beads, eyes hollow, but strangely serene. Visitors came from villages and mountains afar, kneeling before him as if his silence might somehow still whisper wisdom. And maybe it did. Because in a culture where ancestors linger, where spirits dwell in trees, and where the line between human and divine is thinner than the silk of a monk's sleeve, these mummies weren't relics. They were present tense. They still are. But before we go lighting incense in their honor, we should ask, why do this at all? Why take the body, that clumsy, failing, leaking thing, and push it so far beyond its limits? Was this some elaborate cosmic dare? Or was there, buried beneath the silence, an even deeper hunger, one for permanence in a world that promises none? Let's sit with that thought a moment. You might assume a man who willingly transforms himself into a preserved corpse is either deranged or desperate. But that's because you're thinking like someone trying not to die. These monks weren't escaping death, they were collaborating with it, curating it, designing the afterlife like an architect who prefers brick to metaphor. In their view, mummification wasn't death. It was transcendence, but not the flashy Hollywood kind with choirs and clouds. No, it was Buddhahood in the flesh, quite literally. The idea was that by purifying the body and spirit through extreme asceticism, one could awaken to the truth before death arrived. And by aligning every cell, every heartbeat, and every moment of breath with the teachings of the cosmos, the flesh itself would refuse to decompose, not because of embalming, but because it had been made holy. Now that's commitment, but here's the twist that makes it all deliciously eerie. These monks didn't do this for themselves, not exactly. The real motive, the one whispered behind temple screens and carved into forgotten sutras, was compassion. Yes, that old chestnut. See, according to their worldview, humanity was living in an age of decline, a dark time called Mappo, the degenerate era of the Dharma. basically a cosmic recession. The teachings of the Buddha were waning, the world was falling apart, and the hope of salvation felt like a faded scroll at the back of a dusty shrine. So what's a monk to do in an age where words fail and the people suffer? Well, you become a statue of salvation, a beacon of incorruptibility, a visible, tangible proof that enlightenment was still possible. Imagine walking into a wooden temple, candles flickering, incense curling like ghosts through the air. And there he sits, a monk who hasn't breathed in 3 centuries, skin like paper, gaze like granite, but intact, present, there. You could touch the divine. It had teeth. Of course, there's a certain poetry in the contradiction. A man spends years annihilating the self and the ego, the body, the desire, only to become the most visible symbol in the temple, worshipped, dressed, placed behind glass like a celestial exhibit. Self-erasure resulting in permanent presence. That's irony worthy of a sutra. And what of the suffering, the starvation, the solitude, the entombment? That too was a merit. In Buddhism, suffering isn't something to be avoided, it's fuel. The more you endure, the more compassion you generate. Every pang of hunger, every moment of stillness in that pine box was, they believed, an offering. Not just to the Buddha, but to all of us. To the world. Even to the future. A monk mummifies himself not out of morbid pride, but because he believes, quite sincerely, that his self-extinction might help someone else find the path. Or at the very least remember it exists, and what a strange kind of hope that is. But hope, in old Japan, had a face. Sometimes with hollow eyes and flaking skin, still seated, still silent, still waiting. So what did the people do when they met these living relics? How did they react? These villagers, travelers, peasants in straw sandals who wandered into the presence of the undying? You might imagine the local reaction to a self-mummified monk would be one of horror. But no, this wasn't Frankenstein's monster lurching out of the dark. This was reverence, wrapped in awe, tinged with dread, and seasoned with just the right amount of rural gossip. You see, these Sokushin Butsu didn't vanish quietly into legend. They stayed, on display, housed in temple alcoves, seated like serene dolls in lotus position, draped in robes more ceremonial than any funeral. And the people came, by foot, by prayer, by rumor. Because a man who defeated decay wasn't just interesting, he was useful. To a suffering peasant in a harsh winter, kneeling before one of these incorruptible monks wasn't just a religious gesture, it was insurance. Here was someone who had gone all the way through death's door, turned around, and apparently decided the view wasn't worth it. A man like that surely had pull with the cosmos. So people prayed for crops, for fertility, for health, for deliverance from bureaucratic taxes, the usual. Some brought offerings, rice, sake, coins, even little carvings. Others whispered secrets, requests, confessions, because who better to ask for help than someone who had willingly been buried alive and won? The monks became relics, not in the dusty museum sense, but in the medieval Catholic sense. Powerful. They were called hotoke, not just dead monks, but Buddhas, not symbols, not metaphors, but living proof, if one could still call them living, that salvation was a bodily thing, that it could sit, cross-legged and unspeaking for centuries. And yes, of course, they were cared for, dusted, dressed, sometimes even redressed as though they might notice. Their presence conferred legitimacy on the temple, a spiritual asset, and dare we say, a public attraction, a holy figure, yes, but also a local celebrity corpse. The pilgrims brought alms, the alms fed the temple preserved the monk preserved the belief. It was a tidy little economy of sanctity. But not everyone was thrilled. Some found it unnerving. Children, especially. You can imagine a 6-year-old being told, "This is monk Tetsuryu Kai. He's been dead for 200 years and he's watching over us." That's a level of comfort only a particularly devout grandmother can sell with a straight face. Still, the general mood was one of deep, if slightly uncomfortable, veneration. And why not? When everything around you, the crops, the seasons, the government, even the gods, seemed unpredictable, it was oddly soothing to know that somewhere in the mountains a monk had sat in the dark, starved himself into sublimity, and refused to decompose. That sort of stability is hard to come by. So they lit incense, they prayed, they gazed into the dry, leathery faces of these once living Buddhas and saw not horror, but hope. Proof that someone, somewhere, had figured out how to outwit the great dissolver of things. But times change, and not everyone remains enchanted forever, especially not when the state gets involved. You'd think that once a monk had gone through the trouble of embalming himself using nothing but willpower and dietary misery, society would at least have the decency to let him sit in peace. But no, even the self-mummified are not safe from reform. Enter the Meiji Restoration, that fever dream of modernization in the late 19th century, where Japan seemingly overnight tore off its kimono, donned a Western suit, and began pretending it hadn't spent the last 1,000 years meditating on rocks. And with the rise of state Shinto, Western medicine, and shiny new ideas like civilization and public hygiene, the monks in boxes suddenly looked a little backward, embarrassing even. Like a weird uncle locked in the attic, only this one had achieved enlightenment and was scaring foreign diplomats. So in 1879, the Japanese government made Sokushinbutsu illegal, not the mummies themselves. They were grandfathered in, presumably on account of already being dead. But new attempts were banned. Actively preparing to mummify yourself became not just frowned upon, but criminal. Suicide was framed as a modern pathology, not a spiritual gesture. And self-inflicted death, even in the name of cosmic compassion, was suddenly very un-Japanese, or at least very inconveniently so. It's ironic, really. A tradition built on the rejection of impermanence was itself not permanent. History does love a good joke. Of course, the monks didn't resist. You can't exactly protest in silence when your whole job is to be very, very still. But temples stopped encouraging it. The practice faded. And the few remaining Sokushinbutsu, roughly 24 known specimens, were quietly maintained, some hidden away, others displayed more as cultural artifacts than spiritual guides. No more chanting beneath the earth, no more bells from below. And yet, they endured. While the government scribbled laws and society moved on to trains and telegraphs, those dry little figures kept sitting, watching, undecaying. Their presence became awkward, like a sacred relic at a science fair. Too holy to discard, too strange to explain. A relic of a world where religion didn't just whisper about eternity, it preserved it in lacquered pine. Even modern Buddhists find themselves in a bit of a theological pickle. Was Sokushinbutsu suicide, or was it transcendence? On the one hand, it's clearly self-inflicted death, something most Buddhist traditions discourage for obvious karmic reasons. On the other, it was an act of ultimate discipline, selflessness, and spiritual mastery. A kind of anti-suicide, if you like, where the goal isn't to escape suffering, but to absorb it completely until not even the worms dare enter. Some schools quietly praise it, others awkwardly sidestep it. Medical ethics, for their part, prefer not to think about it at all. There's no checkbox on a hospital form for currently undergoing posthumous spiritual crystallization. And yet, despite the bans, the debates, and the slow creep of neon and neonates, the Sokushinbutsu remain. their silence louder than any doctrine, their stillness stubbornly alive in the cultural memory. They are, in a word, unresolved. And maybe that's the point. Because in the end, what are we left with? Not just the husks of men, but the husks of an idea. That death, decay, and disappearance are optional. That the body can become prayer. That a man can sit so long and so still that even impermanence forgets to knock. But their story doesn't end with a law or a shrine. No, it lingers. In tourism, in myth, in the shiver down your spine when you see a photo of those leathery monks, still cross-legged, still staring. The world may have moved on, but they haven't. And strangely enough, they're still useful. You'd think that once a monk had gone through the trouble of embalming himself using nothing but willpower and dietary misery, society would at least have the decency to let him sit in peace. But no, even the self-mummified are not safe from reform. Enter the Meiji Restoration, that fever dream of modernization in the late 19th century, where Japan, seemingly overnight, tore off its kimono, donned a Western suit, and began pretending it hadn't spent the last 1,000 years meditating on rocks. And with the rise of state Shinto, Western medicine, and shiny new ideas like civilization and public hygiene, the monks in boxes suddenly looked a little backward, embarrassing even, like a weird uncle locked in the attic, only this one had achieved enlightenment and was scaring foreign diplomats. So in 1879, the Japanese government made Sokushinbutsu illegal. Not the mummies themselves, they were grandfathered in, presumably on account of already being dead. But new attempts were banned. Actively preparing to mummify yourself became not just frowned upon, but criminal. Suicide was framed as a modern pathology, not a spiritual gesture. And self-inflicted death, even in the name of cosmic compassion, was suddenly very un-Japanese, or at least very inconveniently so. It's ironic, really. A tradition built on the rejection of impermanence was itself not permanent. History does love a good joke. Of course, the monks didn't resist. You can't exactly protest in silence when your whole job is to be very, very still. But temples stopped encouraging it. The practice faded. And the few remaining Sokushinbutsu, roughly 24 known specimens, were quietly maintained, some hidden away, others displayed more as cultural artifacts than spiritual guides. No more chanting beneath the earth, no more bells from below. And yet, they endured. While the government scribbled laws and society moved on to trains and telegraphs, those dry little figures kept sitting, watching, undecaying. Their presence became awkward, like a sacred relic at a science fair, too holy to discard, too strange to explain, a relic of a world where religion didn't just whisper about eternity, it preserved it in lacquered pine. Even modern Buddhists find themselves in a bit of a theological pickle. Was Sokushinbutsu suicide, or was it transcendence? On the one hand, it's clearly self-inflicted death, something most Buddhist traditions discourage for obvious karmic reasons. On the other, it was an act of ultimate discipline, selflessness, and spiritual mastery, a kind of anti-suicide, if you like, where the goal isn't to escape suffering, but to absorb it completely, until not even the worms dare enter. Some schools quietly praise it, others awkwardly sidestep it. Medical ethics, for their part, prefer not to think about it at all. There's no checkbox on a hospital form for currently undergoing posthumous spiritual crystallization. And yet, despite the bans, the debates, and the slow creep of neon and neonates, the Sokushinbutsu remain, their silence louder than any doctrine, their stillness stubbornly alive in the cultural memory. They are, in a word, unresolved. And maybe that's the point. Because in the end, what are we left with? Not just the husks of men, but the husks of an idea that death, decay, and disappearance are optional. that the body can become prayer, that a man can sit so long and so still that even impermanence forgets to knock. But their story doesn't end with a law or a shrine. No, it lingers. In tourism, in myth, in the shiver down your spine when you see a photo of those leathery monks, still cross-legged, still staring. The world may have moved on, but they haven't. And strangely enough, they're still useful. Because here's the thing about mummies who never meant to become mummies. They don't go away. They haunt, not like ghosts, but like questions no one wants to answer at the dinner table. And so the Sokushinbutsu linger, not just in their glass cases, but in the margins of anthropology, quietly defying every category we try to shove them into. You could say they're relics of religious extremism, but that feels lazy. The world's full of people doing strange things for God, and none of them look this composed. You could say it's a cultural quirk, a Japanese oddity, like vending machines that sell neckties. But again, it's not quite right. Because what these monks did wasn't eccentric, it was systematic, rehearsed, codified. It wasn't an accident. It was a statement, only carved not into stone, but into flesh. So what are they? They're proof, perhaps, that impermanence isn't as absolute as we'd like to think. Buddhism of all traditions preaches that everything falls apart. But these men, these stubborn little monastics from the mountains, politely disagreed. They offered their bodies as counter-arguments, and remarkably, the world agreed, or at least it preserved the evidence. And so we're left with this delicious contradiction. Monks who practiced self-erasure, now immortalized. Individuals who claim to transcend the ego, now enshrined with their names, their histories, their dried little faces smiling, like they know something we don't. Anthropologists, naturally, are both delighted and confused. The Sokushinbutsu sit at the intersection of ritual, identity, cosmology, and spectacle. They aren't just dead monks. They're texts. Bodies that tell stories, bodies that refuse interpretation, bodies that participate in ongoing cultural dialogues long after the soul, presumably, has wandered off to better realms. And then there's the modern twist, tourism. Yes, of course we turned them into destinations, wouldn't you? Temples like Dainichibo still draw thousands of visitors. Buses pull up, shoes come off, cameras are quietly, or not so quietly, slipped from pockets. People stare, whisper, shiver. Some laugh nervously, some cry. The irony is painful. Monks who rejected worldly attention now double as travel brochure icons. But it's not all commercial. There's something deeper at work. Even now, in the age of sushi emojis and same-day shipping, people kneel, they pray. Not to be preserved, necessarily, but to understand, to connect, to brush, even momentarily, against a kind of conviction so absolute it outlasted the bones it lived in. And of course, pop culture came knocking too. You'll find Sokushinbutsu cropping up in horror films, anime, Reddit threads, conspiracy theories, always cloaked in a bit of misunderstanding and a lot of aesthetic. The mummy monk becomes a symbol, a trope, a narrative device. But that too is a kind of immortality, isn't it? In the end, what the Sokushinbutsu achieved wasn't just personal transcendence, it was cultural recursion. They became symbols that loop. Bodies that ask, what is a good death? What is a holy life? What happens when devotion collides with anatomy? And perhaps most hauntingly, what if you could leave something behind that doesn't rot, doesn't fade, and doesn't let the world forget you were here? Now, whether you find that comforting or terrifying, well, that's your business, but the monks are still waiting. There's something uniquely human about inventing new and interesting ways to suffer, not just enduring pain. That's easy, that's universal, but crafting it, shaping it, calling it There's something uniquely human about inventing new and interesting ways to suffer, not just enduring pain. That's easy, that's universal. But crafting it, shaping it, calling it sacred, and then passing it down like grandma's soup recipe. That's where things get creative. In medieval Europe, pain wasn't just a byproduct of life, it was a spiritual technology, a divine currency. If pleasure was the devil's calling card, then pain surely belonged to God. And the more of it you could endure, or better yet, inflict on yourself with composure and a scriptural quote or two, the purer your soul. Or so the logic went. Mortification of the flesh had many flavors, from the artisanal hair shirts of monastic circles to the artisanal self-flagellation of, well, everyone else. There were chains around thighs, whips of knotted cord, iron girdles, rocks in shoes, silence, starvation, and occasionally a bit of joyful bone cracking. All done in the name of purification, because nothing says eternal love quite like opening your own wounds in rhythmic cadence while chanting psalms with tears and mild dehydration. The body, after all, was the problem. Soft, greedy, full of urges and inconvenient appetites. It had to be subdued, tamed, broken like a mule until it stopped whispering impure suggestions during Mass. There was no shortage of creative monks ready to lead by example. Pain in this world wasn't simply tolerated. It was choreographed, ritualized, it had rhythm. You see, the right amount of suffering, applied at just the right moment, could supposedly soften even the most calcified sin. It was a kind of mystical exfoliation, scrub your soul raw enough, and maybe the heavens would crack open just enough to take notice. And lest you think this was all private, cloistered stuff, the quiet agony of isolated zealots behind abbey walls, think again. There were parades, public processions of half-naked penitents, backs glistening with blood, walking barefoot through cobbled towns as people whispered prayers, wept, or simply stared with that same morbid curiosity you see in modern drivers passing a crash site. Some found it inspiring, others found it theatrical, a few found it suspiciously performative, but none of them looked away. And beneath all this, humming like a hymn through cracked lips and open wounds, was one persistent idea, that pain cleanses, that by hurting the body, one could purify the soul. It's a motif you'll find repeated with unsettling enthusiasm across centuries and across faiths, always dressed in slightly different robes. Of course, none of this sprang out of nowhere. There were older texts and older wounds, references, examples, sacred models of how to bleed correctly in the name of the divine. And one in particular tends to cast a very long, thorny shadow over this entire business. The justification for all this bleeding wasn't dreamed up by some eccentric hermit with a fondness for iron straps. No, it came straight from the top, from Scripture itself, dense with metaphors that medieval minds took quite literally. And at the heart of it all, Christ's passion, that slow, harrowing descent into agony that ends, as all good stories in Roman-occupied Judea do, with public execution. To the faithful, this wasn't just a sad event, it was the model, the gold standard for redemptive suffering. Christ didn't just die, he suffered deliberately, whipped, mocked, crowned with thorns, nailed into place. It was less a death and more of a ritual. A cosmic drama in which the central character conquers sin not by power, but by pain. So when a medieval monk picks up a whip or slides a cilice around his thigh, he isn't being creative, he's imitating, reenacting, aligning his own fragile, sinful body with the sacred torment of the divine. And the more it hurt, the more it counted. After all, if God himself was willing to bleed, what excuse did you have? Biblical endorsement helped. Verses like, I chastise my body and bring it into subjection were plucked from the epistles and brandished like spiritual instruction manuals. Paul, that enthusiastic early church father with a flair for the dramatic, was especially beloved for giving divine permission to bruise oneself into submission. The body was weak, the soul needed space. Make room, preferably with leather. Then came the theologians, men in robes with ink-stained fingers and a worrying tolerance for poetic cruelty. They elaborated, justified, polished the theology until pain became not just permissible, but necessary. The flesh, they claimed, carried the stain of original sin, that cosmic inheritance from Eden's little fruit fiasco, and the only way to scrub it clean was to suffer. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, physically, loudly, with conviction. Over time, this evolved into something oddly bureaucratic. Pain had value, it could be exchanged. Mortification became a kind of spiritual accounting. Every strike, every tear, every moment of restraint was another credit in your heavenly ledger. Suffering purified, suffering sanctified. Suffering meant you were trying. Of course, this assumes the body is the problem, that it's a vessel full of rot and temptation, dragging the soul down like an anchor, tied to flesh. And if the soul is a bird, the body is the cage, sometimes gilded, but mostly rusted, heavy, and always, always in the way. This idea stuck for centuries. It's what fueled not just the flagellants and monks, but saints, mystics, visionaries, all convinced that pain brought them closer to God. Some even claimed their wounds opened up like flowers during prayer, bleeding spontaneously in perfect mimicry of Christ's crucifixion. The church was cautiously impressed. But theological permission only explains so much, because there's a difference between believing that pain is holy and organizing hundreds of people to march shirtless through the snow, whipping themselves in unison while chanting psalms. That, as it turns out, requires something more. They first appear in the 13th century, striding through Europe like a slow-moving storm of self-punishment and religious theatre. They were mostly lay people, not monks, not clergy, but ordinary souls convinced that the world was on fire, and the only thing that might put it out was the sound of hundreds of backs being struck in sync. The timing wasn't accidental. Europe was in crisis. There were famines, there were wars. And then, of course, came the Black Death, rolling through villages like an invisible scythe. Half of everyone you knew was dying. Priests couldn't explain it. Prayers didn't stop it. So naturally, some decided the apocalypse had arrived early, and the only logical response was to form a traveling brotherhood of pain. The uniform was simple: white robes, hoods, a red cross over the chest, and plenty of exposed flesh. They'd arrive in a town unannounced, barefoot, heads bowed, and then suddenly begin beating themselves in the streets, usually in perfect rhythm. Whips with metal tips, wood soaked in blood, songs written to glorify pain. And no one dared stop them, because what if they were right? They believed the world's sins had angered God, that the plague was divine punishment, and that by scourging themselves publicly and relentlessly they could appease that anger. One lash for every lie, every theft, every impure thought, not just their own, but yours too. They suffered for the collective, a kind of spiritual civic service, if you like, with more blood than paperwork. And the people watched. Some joined, some wept. Others stayed inside and peeked through shutters, unsure whether to pray, flee, or disinfect the cobblestones. It was terrifying and mesmerizing, because these weren't criminals or lunatics. They were believers, caught in a feedback loop of crisis and contrition, using their bodies as public declarations of faith. They weren't welcome everywhere. In some towns, local officials tried to chase them off. The church, especially, grew uneasy. Initially, they tolerated the flagellant, even admired the commitment. But as the movement spread, things started to unravel. The groups grew more organized, more dramatic, and more apocalyptic. Some began preaching unsanctioned doctrines, claiming they didn't need priests or confession, that the whip was enough, that blood was its own absolution. This did not sit well with the Inquisition. Eventually, the church declared the flagellants heretical. They were hunted, arrested, suppressed. The parades ended, the songs stopped. But the idea that pain could heal the soul never quite died. It just went inside, because for every flagellant bleeding theatrically in the town square, there were 10 others doing it silently behind monastery walls, or inside anchor holds, which were essentially stone coffins with a window. The medieval church had a talent for architecture, especially when it came to efficient isolation. These were the anchorites, men and women, often disturbingly young, who requested to be walled into a cell attached to a church. They received food through a slit and sunlight through a smaller one. They weren't prisoners, mind you. They chose to spend decades, sometimes their entire lives, inside 4 feet of holy stone, surrounded by their own breath, their own sweat, and an ever-expanding theology of pain. Their days were structured around stillness, hunger, and controlled self-destruction. No sermons.
No community. Just them, God, and whatever tools they had. A whip, a belt, maybe a nail or 2 in the shoe for good measure. The more creative among them fashioned devices that would have made early dentists weep. Tight cords that bit into the skin, shirts woven from horsehair, beds of splinters, chains that left permanent marks under robes so modest they bordered on the theoretical. And this wasn't about melodrama, no processions, careful.
The kind that didn't bleed out. It settled in. It altered posture, reshaped joints, ground down the self inch by inch until all that was left was a kind of living relic. Still breathing, barely speaking, entirely devoted. In monastic settings, the tone was different, but the goals were more or less the same. Monks weren't showy, at least not officially, but their austerity rituals were legendary, waking at ungodly hours to chant on empty stomachs, avoiding eye contact, whipping themselves before bed to discourage dreams of any warmth, and of course, wearing the cilice, a pleasant little belt or strap embedded with spikes or wire, worn under the habit to remind you with every movement that comfort is the enemy of sanctity. And the women? The female mystics. They took it further. Some refused to eat anything at all, sustained only by the Eucharist and an unsettling amount of approval from their confessors. Others begged for humiliation, to be beaten, to be ignored, to be crucified emotionally, symbolically, and occasionally in practice. Saints were made this way, or at least canonized after they died, preferably of something poetic. Pain in these settings wasn't just purification. It was a language, a private, wordless way of speaking to God. If others couldn't understand, well, that was kind of the point. They weren't performing for the world. They were negotiating with eternity, using their own nerves as bargaining chips. And still, the line between sacred and sickening blurred constantly. At what point does devotion become self-harm? Who decides whether you're a saint or just profoundly unwell? The church, as usual, tried to decide. Sometimes it approved, sometimes it quietly recoiled. It depended on timing, gender, reputation, politics. But no matter the ruling, the practice never stopped. It merely shifted. It became quieter, more structured, less blood, more theology. And eventually, as centuries passed and cities rose and fell, and modernity started peeking in through the shutters, mortification found new uniforms and new tools, some of them made of leather, others made of logic. You've probably heard of Opus Dei. If not from theology textbooks, then certainly from that regrettable Da Vinci Code phase the world went through, where albino monks and hidden conspiracies managed to make Catholicism look like a cross between a spy thriller and a gothic horror novella. Fun. Wrong, but fun. Opus Dei is real. It was founded in 1928 by a Spanish priest named Josemaria Escrivá, who believed in the sanctification of daily life. You didn't need to join a monastery to please God. You could be a teacher, a banker, a mechanic. As long as you did your work well, offered it to God, and maintained discipline over your inner chaos. Of course, some kinds of discipline are more literal than others. Within certain circles of Opus Dei, especially among numeraries, the celibate full-time members, physical mortification is still practiced, quietly, voluntarily, and always behind closed doors. No processions, no chants. Just small, intimate acts of suffering to keep the ego in check and the soul properly sanded. Two tools come up most often. First, the cilice, a sharp metal chain worn around the thigh for a couple of hours each day. Not enough to cause injury, but enough to remind you that comfort is temporary and flesh is to be managed, not indulged. Second, the discipline, a cord used to lightly whip the back during prayer. It's not theatrical, it's not about blood, it's about habit, a ritual. A pause in the day where one's body is gently but firmly reminded that it doesn't run the show. To outsiders, this sounds medieval, barbaric, possibly illegal. But to insiders, it's framed in very different terms. It's not punishment, it's training. The cilice is no more bizarre than a cold shower, or a strict diet, or running uphill at 5 a.m. It's not about self-hate, it's about focus, humility, mastery over the body. A form of spiritual resistance in a world addicted to comfort and distraction. Of course, this logic isn't new, it's just dressed differently. Escrivá himself wrote that the body must be given a little less than it needs, a tidy phrase that wouldn't feel out of place in a monk's journal from 1147. But the context has changed. The world's no longer ruled by famine and plague. We have antibiotics, streaming services, sleep apps. And yet, this ancient instinct, the pain sharpens the spirit, hasn't gone away. It's just been tucked into briefcases and carried into glass offices, where the people still kneel in prayer, and sometimes, quietly, wince a little under their trousers. Opus Dei has always been good at blending old theology with modern aesthetics, a kind of corporate mysticism. Its members attend mass, study, confess, work long hours. Some are teachers, others are judges, scientists, architects. And a few wear a spiked chain for 90 minutes between meetings. It's all very efficient. But even in this updated form, the question remains, why does this logic persist? Why does the equation, pain equals purity, still carry so much weight, even in a world where we claim to have outgrown superstition? Maybe it's not superstition. Maybe it's structure. Maybe it's a way to feel real in a world made of noise. Or maybe we should take a closer look at what pain actually does, not just to individuals but to groups, because it's rarely just about you and your whip. Pain, after all, binds. Pain, in these contexts, isn't just about God, it's about group dynamics. Identity, belonging. When everyone's bleeding, you stop asking why and start asking if you're doing it right. There's a strange democracy in shared suffering, a kind of egalitarian misery where your self-worth is measured not in words, but in how well you flinch in silence. In a flagellant procession or a cloistered cell, pain creates social order. Hierarchies aren't just built on robes and titles, they're etched into skin. The more you endure, the more authority you gain. Mortification becomes currency, the body a ledger. Discipline becomes not just personal, but performative. The ones who suffer best, who suffer longest, get remembered, canonized even. Their biographies are soaked in wounds. And the real twist? Most of this happens in environments where speaking openly is discouraged, where emotion is moderated and confession is structured, and the soul is supposed to whisper, not scream. In that vacuum, pain becomes a language, not a cry, but a code. A way of showing sincerity, loyalty, piety, without ever having to raise your voice. This dynamic breeds a particular kind of self-regulation. You don't need someone watching over you, not when you've already internalized the gaze. The rulebook lives under your skin now. You'll tighten the silice a bit more tomorrow. You'll kneel longer, eat less, sleep worse. No one told you to, but you'll do it anyway, just to feel like you still belong. There's also a curious kind of moral clarity in pain. A sense that you're doing something real, something costly. In a world of indulgence, abstaining, or better yet, hurting, feels like defiance. You don't need to justify your beliefs with words. Your bruises will explain them better than theology ever could. Of course, it's not always noble. Sometimes mortification becomes a performance of virtue, a way to show you're more devout, more disciplined, more holy than the man beside you. And at that point, the whip becomes less of a tool and more of a prop. But even at its most sincere, this kind of ritual suffering walks a very fine line. Between ecstasy and pathology, between transcendence and trauma, because the body remembers even when the soul insists it was for a higher cause. Psychologically, it's not hard to see the appeal. Pain disrupts the ordinary. It cuts through doubt like a blade through linen. It narrows the mind to a single point of sensation, a pure moment where all confusion is burned away. Some call that mysticism. Others call it dissociation. The result, either way, is silence, the kind that feels divine. And what happens to a group built on that silence? It gets tight, intimate, insular, bound not by logic or shared taste, but by mutual, unspoken suffering. The group becomes home, the ritual becomes identity, the pain becomes the proof. But proof of what, exactly? That's the riddle, isn't it? Perhaps we can find an answer, or at least a better question, by looking at how all this pain was turned into symbol, how the body became text, how scars were read like scripture. Pain, once ritualized, stops being noise and becomes language, and nowhere is that more literal than in the way medieval Christianity used the body as a kind of parchment. You don't just bleed, you write. With whips, chains, fasts, restraints, you inscribe your beliefs onto yourself until the line between wound and word disappears. This wasn't metaphorical, it was intentional. The body became a living manuscript, revised daily by those most devout, most disciplined, and frankly most intolerant of comfort. Saints were read by their injuries. Martyrs were canonized by the texture of their suffering. A woman who refused food for decades, she was fasting like Christ. A monk who flayed himself nightly with cords, he was reenacting Golgotha. A man who carved symbols into his skin in the shape of crosses, he wasn't self-harming, he was publishing. And so pain evolved into symbol, a semiotic system etched into nerve endings. Every lash was a syllable, every bruise a gesture, every scar a declaration that this body, soft, sinful, prone to inconvenient urges, had been repurposed as sacred infrastructure. Blood wasn't just fluid, it was ink. And the rituals around it? Highly stylized. Flagellation wasn't random flailing, it had rhythm, sequence, timing. You recited specific psalms with each strike. You paused for breath at set intervals. It was more dance than disorder, more liturgy than frenzy, a kind of sacred choreography of collapse. It all had a purpose, to transform the flesh into theology. Even the tools were curated. The cilis, for instance, wasn't just a crude punishment device. It was symbolic architecture. A spiked belt designed to press into the skin gently but persistently. A constant reminder that holiness is not supposed to feel good. It was the spiritual equivalent of sleeping with a rock under your mattress to build character, except the rock is made of iron and it leaves marks you hope God will notice. But not everyone agreed on where the line was. The church, always slightly suspicious of spiritual freelancers, spent centuries trying to control the narrative. Some wounds were holy, others were suspect, especially when they appeared without cause. The so-called stigmata, those mysterious, Christ-like injuries that popped up on particularly devout bodies, sometimes bleeding in perfect sync with the Passion calendar. Were they miracles, frauds, hysteria, divine photocopying? No one quite knew. But they were revered anyway, turned into spectacles of sanctity. People travelled to see them, to weep near them, to believe a little harder in a world where skin could imitate scripture. And maybe that's the crux of it, the imitation. To suffer as Christ suffered. To embody belief so completely that your nerves became doctrine. And this wasn't unique to Christianity. Across the world, in sun-scorched deserts and humid temples, other cultures also turned the body into symbol through ritual pain. Hooks, piercings, branding, burns. These weren't acts of madness, they were sacraments. In some places they still are. So when we look at mortification through a modern lens, squinting at it like a strange artifact from a darker age, it's easy to forget that pain wasn't always a sign of distress. Sometimes it was structure, meaning a holy stamp. And like all good symbols, it stuck. But symbols, as we know, have a way of lingering. Some get lost in time, others get rebranded, and some get turned into stories, artifacts, museums, movies, fragments of belief, repackaged for consumption. Because these rituals, once whispered in cloisters and screamed into the void by barefoot penitents, didn't vanish. They just changed costume. They shed the blood, mostly, and put on new symbols. Cleaner ones, more photogenic. Mortification now survives in a strange afterlife. Not as doctrine, but as aesthetic. A touch of medieval severity here, a splash of spiritual obsession there, all rendered palatable for modern consumption. You'll find it in films, books, podcasts with ominous Latin titles. And always, always in the subtext. The body as battleground, suffering as spectacle, holiness as something that leaves a mark. Take Hollywood's favorite Catholic villain, the tortured albino monk. Cloaked in shame and shadows, self-flagellating under his robes like he's trying to punish his way into sainthood. It's not accurate, of course, but it's sticky. The image lingers, bleeding as belief, pain as moral compass. It's dramatic, it's archaic, it's excellent television, and it sells. Then there's the religious tourism angle. Pilgrims, and let's be honest, tourists, still flock to places where the old pain soaked deep into the stone. Monasteries with iron whips preserved in cases. Hair shirts carefully mounted like holy taxidermy. Wax figures of saints with terrifyingly realistic wounds. You can buy tiny replicas, read pamphlets, light candles. It's devotion maybe, but it's also voyeurism, a chance to get close to suffering without actually participating. To peer into the rituals of old and say, with a shiver of relief, thank God we're more civilized now, while secretly wondering, what it would feel like to believe something that hard. Even in secular culture, mortification leaves fingerprints. Take fitness culture, or wellness, or digital detoxes where people brag about their suffering. No sugar, no screens, no joy for 30 days. The language is different, sure, but the structure's familiar. Suffering as proof of sincerity, discipline as redemption, pain as personal upgrade. And still deeper, in certain corners of modern Catholicism, small groups continue these practices quietly. They wear cilices. They fast beyond reason. They pray until the edges of themselves blur. They aren't trying to make headlines, they're trying to be good, the old-fashioned way. Meanwhile, anthropologists and theologians write essays with long titles about the phenomenology of pain. Psychologists debate whether self-inflicted suffering is pathology or devotion. Artists turn saintly wounds into oil paintings. And, somewhere in Spain, a museum polishes a medieval discipline whip before opening the doors at 10 sharp. Because pain, it turns out, never really goes out of style. It just rebrands, from penance to performance, from salvation to spectacle, from blood-stained linen to sanitized myth. The rituals have ended, but the hunger for meaning, for purity, for some kind of visceral contact with the divine, that remains. Always somewhere just under the skin.